Hey everybody, and welcome to Compliance with Kudzai. Thank you for all my new subscribers for joining. I'm so excited to be sharing a lot more content and hopefully a lot more frequently, but making no promises. But today, I'm super excited because one of the videos that you guys seem to have liked a lot that I made a few years ago, how to do a compliance risk assessment, recently reached the 30,000 view mark. And to commemorate that, to honor that, to thank you for the views, I've decided to do a part 2, which is what we're talking about today, a part 2 video. And in that video, I'm going to be going a lot more in depth. Think about that first video as your foundation video so that you really grasp the high level concept. And now I'm going to explain in a lot more detail what we are talking about when we are talking about the risk assessment process that you need to be doing as a compliance officer. So what I want to do right now is share my screen just briefly and to show you something that I think is definitely going to be worthwhile you guys thinking about this image as we have this conversation. So what this is, excuse me, is an illustration from the ISO standards 37301, which speaks to compliance risk management systems. And it's essentially an image that really articulates what we are talking about in terms of what must be put in place for a compliance system as its whole. But today, what we're going to be focusing on is that box in the middle there that talks to risk assessment. And you can see there are 3 components: risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. And a question that I often get in my workshops when immediately this image pops up in one of the slides is, what's the difference between risk analysis and risk evaluation? And so since it's a frequently asked questions in my training and workshops, today I am going to be sharing with you and explaining each of those little boxes so that you are on the same page and you know what each and every one of those little boxes is, okay? So I'm going to stop sharing now and we're going to jump straight back into this conversation, okay? Okay, so first things first, the risk assessment process, as defined in those standards that I described earlier on, is you must do a risk identification, a risk analysis, and a risk evaluation for you to be considered to have conducted a risk assessment. Now, what are each one of those things? If you've watched the previous video, you'll have a clear idea. If not, go back and watch the video and then come right back to this one as we go into a little bit more detail. But if you haven't watched it in a while, you might want to go back and start there. But let's continue with this conversation. So risk identification, starting there. Step 1. That is the process of cataloging everything that applies to your business from a regulatory perspective. So you employ individuals, your labor law is going to apply. You have to have what do you call these? Fire extinguishers and rails on stairs and all of those good things, health and safety regulations, they would apply. You have to pay taxes, income taxes, payee for your employees, capital gains, whatever it is, depending on what you do as an organization, you have to make sure that you're paying value-added tax. You have to make sure that you're paying those taxes. And then you're in the banking industry. What are the banking laws that apply to you? Codes of conduct. What are the mining laws? You know, whatever. Depending on the nature of the business, there are the laws that apply as a result of the activities, services, products that you offer. And then there are laws that apply to you almost at a legal entity level. So what you're doing in your risk identification is cataloging all of that, identifying what you need to be aware of, and then say, within each of those laws, I'm going to extract the 50 provisions, the 80 provisions, the 100 provisions, the 3 provisions, whatever the case is, and catalog them individually into a regulatory universe. That is your catalog. That is the risks that you have identified that you need to comply with. I'll give you an example. Let's say from an AML perspective, you have identified that you need to report suspicious activities. Section 103 of whatever the act is in your jurisdiction. You're going to write that specific requirement in your regulatory universe and you've captured that as a risk that you've identified, that this is something that we as a business need to comply with, and if we fail, there will be a risk associated with that and a consequence associated with that. So you're going to do that for every piece of legislation that you have identified as applying to your business, either at a legal entity perspective or as a result of the activities that you do. The products that you sell. So it can actually be quite a massive undertaking. Like I said in the previous video, imagine multinationals, so they have to do that for every single jurisdiction in which they operate. So it is a mammoth task, but very important that you get that right. So that's your risk identification piece, step one. And if you guys can hear my dog barking, I'm ignoring him. I hope you can too. Step two, risk analysis. That part of the risk assessment process is now what we need to really make sure that we're understanding. And I spoke about it at a high level in the previous video, the first one on how to do a compliance risk assessment. So now we're going into some more detail. Risk analysis is the section where you are doing what we talked about in terms of analyzing the impact of non-compliance. What will happen if we fail to do what we have been told we need to do as a business? If we fail to comply with market conduct rules and regulations, with anti-money laundering, with our obligations under our company registration. So whatever the case is, for each legislation, we need to understand the consequences, and therefore that will help us to analyze the impact if we fail to comply. So that's where you're going to be saying, is this a high impact event, a medium impact event, or a low impact event? So you're going to do that with each of the requirements that you have identified in that risk identification process. So then you're also going to look at the likelihood and analyze that. And the likelihood is always based on your control environment. Based on the controls we have in place, how likely is it that we are going to have a breach, a non-compliance event? Do we have the right skills in our organization? Do we understand the requirements? Is this a complex law or a simple law that's easy to understand? Do we have automated processes or manual processes? You're going to consider various things to determine and analyze what the likelihood is that an event is going to take place. And again, you're going to say, is this a high likelihood or a low likelihood kind of event? And there are the rating scales that you would look at that are applied as best practice. So then that's all part of your analysis. Then you're going to say, my control environment, is this a strong control environment or a weak control environment? Are my controls highly effective or ineffective? You have to do the analysis of looking at your controls that are in place today, not some, wishful thinking situation, and say, how do I rate these controls from an effectiveness perspective? So the analysis is all about looking at the consequences, the likelihood, and your control effectiveness, and coming up with an overall view of what your risk looks like. That is your risk analysis component of the risk assessment process. Now, risk evaluation, step 3. What does that look like? Risk evaluation is when you now then take the risk analysis work that you have done, the output of all of that, you now understand your risks. What is your high risks, your residual risk, what that's left over after you've looked at your controls? What is that in relation to the business's risk appetite? How much are they willing to expose themselves to in the achievement of a particular objective? How much, what is their appetite for risk? Some organizations have a low appetite for risk and they only say, oh, this is as far as we're going to achieve that. And if we haven't achieved it with this much investment or risk taking, then we're not taking anything further. Some organizations have a higher risk appetite. They will take it all the way to the edges of the cliff before they push the brakes. So based on the organization's risk appetite, next to the outcome of your analysis, What are we looking at here? Do we need to make different decisions? That's your evaluation. Do we need to, are we happy? Are we saying that everything was within our risk appetite, no further action required? Do we need to treat the risk? And you know, my next video is going to go into a lot more detail about risk treatment, but are we saying we are adding more controls? Are we transferring the risk? You know, are we tolerating the risk? What are we doing from a risk treatment perspective? Or is the risk so terrible that we're saying as a business, we just do not want to be in this space anymore? I see sometimes you can see in the media, you know, organizations pulling out of countries, pulling out of different markets, pulling out of offering certain products. They've done an evaluation in that instance and said from a risk perspective, and maybe it might not be risk related, it might be profitability related, but let's use that for now. From a risk perspective, this is now too high risk for us. You know, maybe there's a war in the situation or threat of war, so they've decided to stop business until things settle down. So you'll see that decisions are being made on the back of the risk analysis and the risk evaluation, and then they decide to treat the risk, and termination is one of the options. So that is essentially what we're talking about when we say, what are we looking at from risk assessment? First, you identify your risk. You can't analyze something that you haven't identified. So you have to do that as a very thorough exercise. Then we analyze the risk. What are the impacts? What are the likelihoods? What is our control environment looking like? And the output of that analysis is going to inform our evaluation and say, based on the outcome of the analysis and saying that the risk appetite of the organization looks like this, what decisions are we making about the way forward? That is your evaluation. And then that gets followed now by the risk treatment process. But like I said, that'll probably be my next video, so stay tuned. But that's essentially it when we're talking about risk assessment. There are those 3 steps that you need to make sure you are completing in their entirety and reviewing. It's a living document, it's not one and done. Risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. That's your process. So I hope you found this video informative and gave you a lot more depth on that risk assessment video from 2 years ago, I think it was, I can't remember. So watch these 2 videos together and you will be well positioned to be able to do your own risk assessment. If you want to grab some templates like the Regulatory Universe templates, we have that at our online store. That will show you how you're supposed to catalog and document your risk identification. But if you want to do a risk analysis with me, you're going to have to sign up for one of my workshops or my boot camps, because it's I like to hold your hand and guide you through, and that's not something I can give you in a template, quite frankly. So thanks for watching this video, guys. I hope to see you at one of my trainings or boot camps in the near future, and we get to engage one-on-one on all these delicious, meaty, juicy compliance risk management topics. So I look forward to hearing from you soon, and yeah, risk treatment coming right up, okay?